Welcome, everyone. We're really glad to have you join us today for our LabOps Safety by Design webinar. This is the first in a series of HSE webinars that we'll be running, so we really hope to see you back again for some of our future sessions. I am joined today by my colleague Sian and also Jenny, who is an independent HSE consultant, and for that kind of unfiltered expert view. My name is Ali. I've been with MyAmici for about a year. I'm head of strategic projects. Before that, I was in, I've been in the biopharma industry for over 25 years, and 12 to 13 of those have been in lab operations and facilities management. So HSE very much part of my remit. And I was also a customer myself of Amici for over 10 years. So I know the system from both angles. Sian, did you want to go next to introduce yourself?
Yep. Hi, I'm Shan. I'm a solutions consultant here at Amici. My background's in microbiology. I also have hands-on health and safety experience. I was a lab manager at a scaling biotech prior to working at Amici. So yeah, nice to meet everyone. Jenny, I'll hand over to you.
Hello, my name's Jenny, and I am the co-founder and director of Regulus Safety Consultants. I started out life many years ago as a research scientist, spent 10 years as an R&D scientist, and then accidentally fell headfirst into health and safety because literally no one chooses it. It really is something that you accidentally happen. And I've spent the last 13 years or so in health and safety. At least 7 of those years, I've been a chartered member of IOSH. That's kind of where I'm at right now. And my superpowers are in chemical and ergonomic safety, but I cover pretty much all of it.
Brilliant. So you're in good hands today, everybody. The session will be about 20 minutes long. We'll do our best to stick to time for you all. We'll be discussing the 6 principles that are in the ebook with the same title, Lab Safety by Design. And we'll be giving, as we go through those principles, real life examples of what can go wrong if you don't put those principles in place. And I'm sure some of these will resonate with the audience. Well, we should have some time at the end for some questions and answers as well. So please pop any questions in the chat as we go along. So just to sort of set the scene a little bit, most HSE failures in biotech don't actually start in the lab. They start before the product even gets into the organization. They start in procurement. The moment a scientist clicks buy now with no risk assessment, or a biological material arrives with no containment check, that's where the risk enters the building. But these moments are also the ones where, the biggest improvements can actually be made, not by working harder, but by designing a workflow so that the safer choice is also the easier one, because human nature is path of least resistance. So let's make it about that. So that's safety by design, and that's what today is all about.
Yeah. And, this problem persists across the board because we all know labs are moving fast. Our scientists are under pressure. Everything was to get done yesterday. And so ultimately, health and safety really feels like that friction. It's seen as a blocker. It's the form that often case you fill out after you've done the work. So we're managing it in some cases retrospectively rather than proactively. In early stage biotechs, that informal oversight can really work at 10 people. You've got good visibility over what's happening. But as your company scale, we really see that's where it quietly stops working. But in some cases, no one's even noticed yet. And the moment that really then forces that issue is a reactive, real life issue that's occurred. Unfortunately, it's not proactive foresight to prevent the issue. An example that I've seen is, finding a hazardous chemical in a shelf. There's no record of who ordered it. There's no handling, storage, or disposal instructions or knowledge, and there's no processes in place at all. I guess, Jenny, that's from my experience, but from your experience, you've worked across numerous biotech organizations. What does that moment of realization that the health and safety needs to be improved actually look like?
You're absolutely right. It's almost always reactive. And more often than not, it's something really serious has gone wrong. So it's not something small, like someone finding a chemical somewhere where it shouldn't be. In my experience, people really start to take seriously when a breach happens or they have to make some kind of riddle report because of a significant near miss. It's not usually so much an incident, it's usually a very serious near miss. And then panic ensues because they've got to report it to the HSE and they don't know what that's going to look like and whether the HSE are going to want to take it further. And it is usually, like you say, because people are super busy, and particularly with small startups, there are only so many hats that one person can wear, and things do drop off. That's kind of my main experience.
And I think what you've described there, Jenny, is a pattern, isn't it, really? A near miss or an incident is what it takes to raise the profile of health and safety to senior management and force it to be a priority. And the frustrating thing about that is that by the time that happens, you've already spent more money trying to fix it. You might have reputational damage. You may have downtime as well in the labs as a result of that. So the question is really, where in the workflow can we actually get ahead of that? And the answer consistently is procurement before anything enters the building. And that's exactly what we want to address today in the 6 principles. So let's walk through them. So starting with the first one, putting safety where decisions happen. So this is about embedding hazard visibility and approval gates at the point of purchase, not after delivery when the problem has already entered the organization. So this is about kind of surfacing those hazards, GSH codes, cautious requirements, sort of at the ordering interface, not, afterwards. It's before anyone actually approves that order. You don't want it buried in an SDS somewhere on a shared drive that doesn't that's outdated, for instance, or nobody ever looks at. And this is also where the hierarchy of controls start, which is really important about health and safety, good health and safety management in an organisation. And giving scientists that information allows them to make an informed decision about possibly eliminating that product altogether because it's too dangerous and they don't actually want to handle it, or substituting it for something safer. So it's really giving the power back to the scientist. So Jenny, when you're advising organizations, how often do you find that hazard information is not visible and they're actually totally unaware of how dangerous it is of the product that they're ordering? And what's the practical implication of that?
So it's super common, and it all comes back down to that idea of you're a small organization, you're super busy, you need to meet those kind of landmarks, or I can't think of the word now. The landmarks will have to do. The
Stones?
next, you have to meet those milestones to get the next injection of cash. So actually, you're so concentrated on getting the work done. What you don't do is put your risk assessment in place in advance of that work. And your risk assessment is your planning tool, your safety planning tool. So you then end up ordering something, and it could be really quite dangerous, and you don't realize how dangerous it is because you haven't written your risk assessments, you haven't looked at any relevant SDSs, you haven't made sure that you've got your controls in place so that you actually can work with that thing when it arrives. It then arrives, and then you try and work with it, and actually it might be that you shouldn't even have it on site because you don't have the relevant controls in place, or you don't have the relevant licenses in place, or simply you aren't set up for it. So then you've got something that you can't work with. You might not even be able to legally store, and it may be really, really difficult to get rid of it. You can't even dispose of it easily. And that's something that I do see quite commonly, just simply because people don't have their risk assessments in place. And it's all down to time management, and it's all down to resource.
And those controls that you've mentioned are exactly the gap that we're talking about. System design matters as much as the intention to purchase. And that really does bring us on to the second principle, and that is that make compliance the easiest path. So that's whenever your safest option is also the fastest, then people are going to follow it by default. So for example, if you're completing a risk assessment, if that is a separate manual step outside your typical order and workflow, it's easy to skip that under pressure. If it's built in a format where the order cannot progress without it, it becomes a habit for everyone involved rather than a task. The scientist behavior can then flip positively. They start to think about the documentation prior to going to order, not after, because they know that they can't proceed without that risk assessment being in place. There's no path of least resistance. It's built into that approval. It actually also makes it an easier process for all those involved to have that in those pre-built pathways. There's really clear ownership of tasks and expectations for everyone through that purchasing process to make sure you don't get to the point that Jenny just explained of having something on site that you shouldn't be handling.
And it's great that, we've started off having this interception at the point of purchase, but, that's not really enough because then you're always relying on that process never failing. So that brings us on to principle 3, which is having 2 interception points and not 1. And this is about, yes, you're catching it at requisition, which is brilliant and a really good first gate. But the second one, you have another opportunity to also prevent that potential hazard coming into contact with an end user, and that is at goods in. Now, goods in is often treated as purely like a logistical function, which it very much is, but it's such a useful secondary gate for health and safety. And if the individual involved has appropriate training, then that can be a really key asset to ensuring additional safety throughout your organization. And so, Jenny, I'm sure again in your experience, you've seen this before and it's quite common. So where cases have sort of slipped through at requisition and were caught at goods in or vice versa, what does that actually look like in practice, and what are those implications to the organization or to the individuals?
So sadly, I would say it very rarely gets picked up at goods in, and usually because of what you've mentioned, this idea of training. Often goods in operatives aren't trained in what they should be looking for. So the kinds of things that do get picked up at goods in are usually the kinds of things that have scary pictograms on them. But actually, there are lots of things that can slip through the net that don't have those scary pictograms on. And equally, if they handle a lot of things with scary pictograms on, they don't really think anything of it. So I tend to find that the slip goes past goods in, and actually you don't discover that thing until it's being worked with in the lab. I've had that as an example before. I've had something that should have been containment level 3 arriving called BSL level 2, and BSL level 2 is not the same as hazard group 2 or hazard group 3 or hazard group 1 for that matter. It can be any of those, it can span across them. So the goods in operative just saw BSL2, sees that all the time, pans it out, and then it actually ended up in a lab. And the only reason that we discovered that there was a problem was because someone asked a question about it. One of the scientists asked a question about it, at which point we panicked and said, oh dear, no, stop, kill it. Kill it, kill it. You're working with a hazard group 2 organism. We don't have a containment level 3 facility. We need to kill it. And then it took us about 3-4 months to get rid of it because we couldn't dispose of it easily either, because the whole campus didn't have anything containment level 3 on it. There are all sorts of instances like that. We've had similar things with irradiators. We found those in a lab under inspection, and we didn't have a license to have that irradiator in the lab. Well, that irradiator did come in through goods in, but nobody knew to do anything about it because they didn't really have any training and they weren't sure what was happening. So it all comes down to a combination of training and risk assessment again. If those goods in operatives have access to the risk assessments, then they'll know what they should be receiving, what they shouldn't be receiving. And equally, the scientists should know in advance whether it should be coming in or not. But if that risk assessment isn't in place and that goods operative has no training, it will just slip the net, and then you could end up working with something that could cause a fatality, or you could be breaking the law.
I think that just highlights as well that one interception point isn't enough. Everyone has different skill sets and different knowledge bases that ultimately the company should be drawing on from start to finish. I think it's also really important that, as you say, everyone's doing those risk assessments, and ultimately then the system's prompting much earlier in the process, as early as possible, to catch everything as soon as you possibly can, with points of interception then throughout. That's what Principle 4 is about. It's really that, scientists should be doing the assessments, the system should be doing the prompts. The scientists need to own the risk assessment. They understand the intended use of the goods, the conditions, they add that critical context, and that ownership should stay with them ultimately. The system's job is to ensure that the assessment actually happens as early as possible. It prompts when it's missing, and it records that automatically, so you've got that paper trail. So ultimately, it stops the progression of any ordering without the presence of the risk assessment. Something that I hear regularly whenever I speak with clients is discussions about safety data sheets as the risk assessment. And of course, an SDS is not a cost assessment. It describes the hazards of that substance in complete isolation, whereas the cost assessment really evaluates, the process, how you're using those goods, what concentration and in what context. Jenny, I think it could be useful to our audience for you to touch on that SDS as the risk assessment confusion. How common do you think that is, and ultimately what can go wrong with that?
Again, super, super common. People, for some reason, there's a really big confusion between SDS, cost assessment, and then risk assessment. People often think that a cost assessment is not a risk assessment or is a risk assessment and is different from a risk assessment, and it's not. A COSH assessment is literally a risk assessment of a hazardous substance. And then you use your SDS to get the information that you need to populate your COSH risk assessment. So I always try and get people to call it a COSH risk assessment rather than a COSH assessment, so that you get on board that idea that it is a risk assessment. It's not just a collection of information. You need to collect your hazards, assess them, and then add the relevant controls to mitigate those risks that you've identified in that COSH risk assessment. And equally, another thing that I often find is people think that a COSH assessment is, I've got a chemical, I've risk assessed it, we're done. And now I don't need to do any further risk assessment on it. That's not true. A COSH risk assessment is risk assessing that chemical or that hazardous substance, because it's a hazardous substance, as part of a whole process. Because if you mix one thing with another, like for instance, if you dissolve something that is fatal if it gets into your blood system with DMSO, you've now made a chemical injection. Perhaps it couldn't cross the skin barrier, but you've put it in DMSO. So now you've made a chemical injection, which causes all sorts of problems. Something that could only have been sort of fairly low risk to work with is now quite high risk. If you hadn't risk assessed it as a part of the whole process, you could have missed something very big and ended up with dead people on the floor. So that's another thing that I find. And then last but not least, I find that people often think that by taking their MSDS and then taking out all the hazardous information and inputting it into a COSH inventory, they've now done their COSH. You haven't. All you've done is you've collected all of the hazards and you've put them into a lovely inventory, which is a fantastic thing to have, but you still must write your risk assessments that lead from that. You can use your COSH inventory to help you populate your COSH risk assessment, but they are separate documents and they are both important in their own right. Basically, your SDS is your hazard Bible and your COSH risk assessment is your plan.
And that's, I think, a really important distinction that you make there, Jenny. And as you say, really, really common. And I've seen that multiple times in organisations that I've worked in as well. And I think it really highlights exactly why the documentation is key. And that trail, that documentation trail really, really matters. Because if the right assessment isn't happening, there's no record that it did. And that's what Principle 5 addresses, audit trails sort of as a byproduct. And this is where every order, every approval and document link creates a permanent auditable record automatically. So if any of you have experienced a health and safety audit, it can be incredibly stressful. I've been through them myself, and it can be a bit of a scramble. If you haven't got things in place, if you haven't got good systems, you're kind of running around at the last minute trying to pull together information from emails, spreadsheets, or even create risk assessments that should have been there and weren't actually in place. And if this is something that you're doing, then it's never going to go well and you're always playing catch up. So if you have something where the trail builds itself as people do their normal work, there's no extra admin, there's no extra sort of separate record keeping. You're just kind of shifting towards more of a system that just works automatically as people go through their day-to-day ordering and processing with regards to health and safety. And that brings us into Principle 6, I think, Sian.
Yeah. Principle 6, the last but certainly not the least, is that safety culture starts at the top. If your senior leadership isn't visibly committing to health and safety, nothing is going to change in the laboratory. Systems are really only going to take place if leadership are really modeling that behavior to the entire team. And, for those leaders, it's so important because under that UK corporate manslaughter law, the liability for a gross failure or safety oversight can actually attach personally to those senior leaders. So it really does have legal weight, and it's so important. It's not just a cultural point. On the screen, we're just about to present the Bradley curve. And ultimately, this maps how organizations mature their approach to safety in 4 different stages. And that's going from reactive to proactive safety management. So in the pink here, you've got stage 1, which is reactive. Ultimately, this is where people are acting on their instincts. They're often driven by reactions to incidents. So the staff may think safety is important. We do a lot every time there is an accident. So that's where those accidents are seen as inevitable and there's not much preventative happening. The next in the yellow is your dependent, and that's where there is rules and supervision in place. Management ultimately are driving that safety. Your team have systems in place to help them manage the hazards and follow these, but it's often yet because they have to follow these processes. The third then is your independent, And that's where you see everyone in the team really start to take more of a personal responsibility for safety. They start to own health and safety in the workplace and awareness. Everyone's engaged in safety and they believe in the rules that are in place. And the final is the interdependent. And this is really where you have shared responsibilities. Safety's embedded in the culture and it's ultimately sustained without enforcement. Team members, you'll start to see them intervene when they see unsafe behaviors. Accidents, incidents, near misses, etc., are all used for learning. And there is an understanding that mistakes are inevitable, but preparation is key to prevent these as much as reasonably possible. So, this Bradley curve model really argues that sustainable safety requires an entire cultural shift. It's not just rule enforcement, and everyone's involved. At the end of the webinar, there'll be a link to a quiz as well where you can check your in-house safety and see where you sit in the Bradley curve.
So that's the framework, 6 principles that shift that safety from that reactive that Sean's just shown you on the curve to sort of more of an embedded sort of safety culture. But what does that actually feel like in practice when it's working? When you've come out of that chaos of the reactive situation into some calm and sort of systems and process. Has anyone ever felt that calm? Drop it in the chat if you have. It'd be great to hear that some people have experienced it. So let's get into that really. Sean, in a past life, you were a lab manager. What's the first thing people notice when that is actually working?
I'd say the key area you really start to see a shift in is your time and resource required for management of this. Your manual approval and chasing disappears. The process ultimately becomes straightforward. It's clear and it's fast. The bottlenecks as well become really obvious then that you can unearth these. When your health and safety is working, it should be easy, it should be consistent, compliant, and scalable. As a lab manager, you stop being pulled into that compliance admin. But then from a scientist's perspective, you also stop getting blocked pre-experiment or mid-experiment, which is so frustrating. And those scientists are taking a more proactive responsibility to stop that happening in advance. So really, whenever the compliance is happening, you just see that friction be completely eliminated. And also, I think the major element is everyone's engaged in the safety, not just management.
And that's a really nice feeling when that happens because the responsibility isn't all on that one person. And we all know what that can feel like. So, Jenny, as a kind of external person coming into one of these organizations and you're assessing where they are on that curve, what's the clearest signal to you that sort of compliance is embedded rather than enforced or an afterthought?
So actually, that's an interesting one. And it's a lot about people watching, I suppose. So when I visit a new client, I usually have a point of contact. And that point of contact is usually the person who's been tasked with trying to look after health and safety on site. And I can usually tell from a quick conversation where they're at based upon how frazzled that person is. So if they're really strung out and they've got 50 million things all to do at the same time, and at least 50% of those are health and safety things where someone has just said, well, I just think because health and safety is a thing we need to do, and because that's a hat you're wearing, I just think you should probably do it all. That's normally what the response is. I just think you should just do it all. And this person is like, I don't really know where to begin. I don't know how to do any of this stuff. I actually don't really have any training in it, but I know it needs to get done. So we've asked you if you could come in and help. And can you just do it all? And at that point, I know that the safety culture there is really quite in its infancy. And actually, what I need to do is really help that company understand that to be safe and secure in safety culture, what they really need to be doing is making sure that the senior leadership team, again, right from the top, they turn up to the health and safety committee meeting, they action, they provide resource in the form of time and money, and they provide support to the person that they're giving that health and safety hat to. So if the scientists are all super busy, they need to actually say, we need to have our risk assessments in place. So what I'm going to say is everyone just needs to down tools and get those done. I know that we've got milestones to meet, but it's really important that we have these in place. So everybody sort yourselves out, find out what you need to do and then get it done. I'm giving you the time to do that. I'm giving you the resource to do that. The health and safety consultant will help you. And whoever the health and safety kind of lead will hold your hand whilst doing that as well, but they're not going to do it for you. So it's about that person not doing everything and everyone just taking on a little bit of responsibility. And then the very top, knowing what they're supposed to be doing. So having had the relevant training to understand what their position is, and then making sure that everybody is taking part, not just one person.
And that image really resonates with me, Jenny, in terms of a health and safety person being frazzled, and I'm sure many of the audience as well. And I think that just demonstrates in an organisation that sort of it's not a people problem, it's more of a leadership problem, because safety hasn't been prioritised and hasn't been adequately resourced. And that's the difference between meeting your duty of care and not as an organisation. Let's just bring this together as we're running out of time to get to some questions and answers. So we've gone through the 6 principles with you today. None of these require a complete overhaul. They just require a shift in where that safety thinking happens. As we said earlier on, we will send you at the end of this session, look out for it in an email, our ebook and self-assessment quiz, along with the recording of today's session. And there'll be more sessions in this series, so please do look out for those, and we hope that you can join us. So on a last note, if you wanted to leave the audience with one thing they could do this week, Jenny, to initiate that positive shift along that curve that we showed you, what would it be? What would your advice be?
Risk assessment, risk assessment, risk assessment again. If you've got your risk assessment in place, you've got your safety plan in place, and it means that you know exactly what your process requires and you know exactly what you need in place to be able to do that work. You know you're going to be safe and legal. Risk assessment all the way. It's boring, but we have to do it.
Best advice. Absolutely. So that's a wrap for us. Thank you very much to Sian and also Jenny for taking the time to join us today. Thank you, our amazing audience, for also joining us. We hope you found that really useful and that you will join us again for future sessions. So we've got a very short amount of time for a couple of questions. There's not any in the chat, but Jenny, I have one for you, actually. So you said in your experience, it's almost always an incident or a breach that forces that issue. For those organisations that you work with, what tends to be the one thing that they wish they'd done earlier?
It's very boring, but I'm going to say risk assessment again. Tend to find that there's a massive panic because if you have had some major breach and you have to report it to the HSE either as a riddle or because you've made a major breach, if you don't have your risk assessment in place, you know you're illegal. And as a result, you know that you're prosecutable. And as a result, you know that there's a far greater likelihood that the HSE might want to come and visit. And if they do, you might end up with an improvement notice or a prohibition notice or worst case scenario, prosecution. And that's really anxiety making. And it can literally be excruciatingly painful to wait for a response. It's always the risk assessment.
Good advice. We have a question in the chat. Is there a way to tie in visibility of risk assessment to the procurement of that chemical or stroke reagent and approval level? So, I mean, I guess that's more of an internal system that you would have as an organisation, keeping a record of products that you've purchased and then having a system whereby there's a link to that product for the relevant risk assessment, almost like you can have a chemical audit and each of those chemicals has the relevant risk assessment associated with it. So really that's kind of an internal process. I don't know, Jenny, if you've got any comment on that.
Yeah, so you can use tools. There are various platforms that can help you do that, or you can use a simple Excel spreadsheet, basically. I think often the way to make sure that you tie your risk assessment into procurement is to make sure that you don't have everybody on site able to make orders. So if you've got a couple of people that make orders and then all of your kind of procurement orders go through those 2 people, they can always then check to make sure a risk assessment is available. It's all about forms that you put in place yourself. And it could be something simple as you can't make an order without providing a risk assessment reference. And then the person who's putting the order through checks to make sure it's there. And then you've got your vapor trail, if you see what I mean. That's sort of the best I guess I can come up with quick.
Yeah, I think it goes back to control again, doesn't it? Visibility and control. So if you've got key people that can place those orders and the training that we mentioned earlier with the goods in team, I think similar to procurement, people involved in purchasing for your organisation, make sure they're trained and only set people can do ordering like that. And then you've got an additional gate to stop it being ordered in the first place. If you don't have a sort of a sophisticated system that can prompt it for you, use the people and use training.
Yeah.
We are at time, so I think that's a wrap for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. We hope you've really enjoyed it. We've enjoyed having you and having these discussions. Look out for the emails at the end with all the information that we said, and we wish you a very good rest of your afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you
so much, everyone. Bye now.
Bye.